What is up, awesome peeps? Brent McCluskey here with Electrified Reviews, and today we are going over the Cityrover S5 electric scooter. This thing is dope. I really enjoyed reviewing this thing, testing it out, lots of fun. This scooter has a front 250 watt motor and it has a rear 250 watt motor. This is the first scooter that I've seen with dual motors. Really sweet. It also has a front light, it has a brake light, it has a 36 volt 10.4 amp hour battery, it's got a top speed of about 16 miles an hour and a top range of about 20 miles. This scooter is awesome, it's a lot of fun. Let's dive into it. All right, let's break this bad boy down. We are going to talk about the specs of this machine. We'll talk about some of the pros, some of the cons, some things I'd like to see done differently in future models. But first things first, let's talk about the power. So again, this machine has a 250 watt motor in the front and a 250 watt motor in the back. That's awesome. So that gives it a total combined power of obviously 500 watts, which is pretty powerful. I mean, that's as powerful as a lot of the electric bikes that I test. So 500 watts of power in something that is much lighter than a huge electric bike that weighs something like 55, 60 pounds. Very cool. This thing has a lot of pep, a lot of zip to it, and it definitely gets me moving pretty quickly, which is quite a feat because I weigh 200 pounds, so very cool. These motors also run pretty quietly, they don't make a lot of noise, and I did not find in my experience that they produced too much heat, so they ran pretty cool even when I was going up hills and when I was putting them under heavy strain. All right, peeps, we've talked about the power, now let's talk about the speed. The S5 has a top speed of around 16 miles an hour or so. It's going to depend on what kind of terrain you're tackling, how much you weigh, how much battery you have left, stuff like that. And 16 miles per hour may not sound like it's that fast, but this is an electric scooter, not an electric bike or an electric skateboard. So for me, it does feel like it's still pretty quick. Now, because it's only 16 miles per hour for top speed, that means that the torque or the gearing for this thing is actually pretty good. So for someone like me who might weigh more than the average rider, I was able to climb pretty steep hills with this thing because the top speed is relatively low. Dig that. All right, power is knocked out, speed is knocked out. Let's talk about specs. The S5 is made from carbon fiber, mostly in the stem right here, and aluminum alloy for the frame, giving it a curb weight of 26 pounds, which is not that bad at all. It's also got a length of about 36 inches, a width of about 17 inches, and a height of about 41 inches. Inside here on the bottom, we've got the battery. This is a 36 volt, 10.4 amp hour battery with Samsung cells. Pretty big battery for a relatively small electric scooter. That's going to help give you that range of around 20 miles or so, depending on, again, riding conditions, how much you weigh, how fast you're going, stuff like that. Now, what I dig about this thing is, like I mentioned, it does have a front light and a brake light. So let's see if you guys can see this real quick. If I turn this, boom, check out that front light right there. And now when you turn the lights on with the press of the button here in the front, you also get a blinking on the rear light right there. And whenever you actually depress the brake right here, you actually get a steady brake light, kind of like a car or electric bike, whatever. Very cool, I like that a lot. On the control center up here on the top, you've also got your current speed, max speed, how much battery you have left, just kind of a basic readout, not a whole lot going on there. You do have 4 levels of power, 1, 2, 3, and something called M, maybe for monster power, I don't know. But you access that by holding down the button here on the front. On the top of the stem here, we've got a hook so you can hang your backpack, your bag, your purse, groceries, whatever. And then down here towards the bottom, we have a latch to close this thing up, make it a lot smaller. And you've also got a little suspension here in the front, which does a pretty good job of dampening bumps in the road, going over cracks, stuff like that. I wouldn't recommend taking this thing off curbs, doing jumps with it, but this little suspension actually does a pretty good job. To close this thing up to make it more portable, there is a quick release lever on the left-hand side and this red latch right here, which you have to pull up to fold the stem down. So it's a two-step process. You undo the quick release lever, pull up on this, and it just folds pretty much like that. I mean, it takes literally like 2 seconds. Unfolding it, same thing. Depress the red lever, unfold it, close the quick release, like 5 seconds, right? Not very long at all. So when this thing is folded, it's obviously much more compact. You can even take out the handlebars if you want. The S5 also has a kickstand on the left-hand side, and in the middle of the deck is a charging port where you actually charge this thing up. The top of the deck is basically like a skateboard deck, or like any other scooter you would see. It's got a nice grippy kind of grip tape on top of it. Does a good job of just keeping your feet in place while you're riding. One last thing I wanted to mention about the specs on the S5 is that the tires have a really nice rounded profile, which may sound common sense, but an issue I found with other electric scooters is that the tire profile is very flat, meaning that it's easy to go straight, but when you want to turn, it doesn't like to turn very well at all. This scooter, great tire profile, and it handles very smoothly, very nicely. All right, awesome peeps, we've talked about the specs, we've talked about the power, we've talked about the speed. Now it's time to talk about some of the pros, some of the cons, and some things I'd like to see done differently in future models. Pro number one probably has to be just the overall construction of this thing. This is a really solid electric scooter. There's no rattling, nothing is loose on it. Again, for a guy who weighs 200 pounds, this is a small-ish scooter, but I didn't find any issues as far as over flexing of the deck, steering issues, anything like that. Very high build quality, and I really appreciate that about this scooter. For the next pro, obviously we've got to throw the dual motors in here. The fact that this thing has two 250 watt motors in the front and in the rear is just really sweet. It makes it a lot more powerful than other electric scooters that are kind of comparable to this, and it makes climbing steeper hills a lot easier. For the third pro, I'm going with the battery. So at 36 volt, 10.4 amp hours, this is actually a pretty big battery. And the range of 20 miles, the estimated range of 20 miles, I actually think is pretty accurate. I was able to get around 15 or 16 miles out of it with modest hills and again, a heavier rider of around 200 pounds. For the third pro, I'm going with the battery. At 36 volt, 10.4 amp hours, this is a pretty large battery, which does a good job of helping get to that estimated range of 20 miles. Next up for the pros is going to be the suspension. Now, it may seem like it's not that much, but this little suspension in the front really does a good job of just smoothing out the ride and making it a little bit easier to ride for longer distances. And when you have that range again of around 20 miles, I think this is something that really ends up paying off in the end. For the next pro, I'm going with the braking. The electronic braking on this is really strong in and of itself, but I love that the S5 also has a physical brake in the back, just like a traditional scooter. So for those emergency stops, you can use the physical brake and the electronic brake, and this thing does stop pretty quickly. For the last pro, I'm going with the integrated lights. The headlight on this is pretty bright. I would say it's almost bright enough that you can actually use it to illuminate your path when riding at night. It's definitely bright enough to make sure that cars and pedestrians see you while you are riding this thing in low light conditions. I also really like that it has a blinking red light in the back, and I love that when you hit the brakes, this thing turns to a constant red, just like a car taillight. All right guys, we've talked about the pros, but like any product, there are going to be cons, so let's talk about the cons. Con number one is going to be the speed. Now, I mentioned earlier that 16 miles an hour is not that bad for a top speed, but because this thing is so powerful with 500 watts of power, it would be cool to have an option to boost the speed to somewhere around 20, 22 miles per hour, something like that. Of course, when you do go that fast, you are going to drain the battery much more quickly than if you keep it at a more modest 16 miles per hour. So maybe that's what Cityrover was thinking with the top speed of 16 miles per hour. Okay, honestly, I'm trying to think of some other cons here because this thing is actually a pretty sweet machine. Really not a whole lot I would change about it. All right, well, one thing, it's not necessarily a con, but since we do have suspension in the front, I mean, it would be cool if we had suspension in the back as well. That would make it even more of a comfortable ride for longer distances. It would mean you could absorb some of the even bigger bumps, but as it stands, with just the front suspension, it actually does pretty good. Now, even though I threw the lights in the pros column, I am going to put them in the cons column as well, just for one major thing, and that is the actual beam pattern of the front headlamp. The beam pattern on this is very wide. It's not really a spot, so again, that's why I mentioned earlier, you can't really use this that well for seeing in the dark. You can kind of navigate your path with this, but it would be cool if it had a secondary light or maybe just an extra LED in there with a deeper dish so you could have more of a throw so you could see further while you're traveling at night. And the last con I'm going to throw up there is the fact that this thing costs around 650 bucks. The price on this is not the most affordable for an electric scooter, but one thing I will say is that even though it is a little pricey, you're definitely getting what you pay for. Again, the dual motors, the really strong brake, integrated front and rear lights. This thing is a sweet setup, high build quality, but it is kind of expensive. Okay, we've knocked out the specs, the pros, the cons, the speed, all that stuff. Now let's talk about who this electric scooter really is for. In my opinion, because of the range on this, because of the battery size, because of the powerful motors on this, this is actually a short distance commuting vehicle in my opinion. Like, this is something where if I was on a college campus where I was traveling, you know, a couple miles a day, something like that, I think this would be fantastic, especially if there were some relatively steep hills that you had to tackle, because again, with the 500 watts of power combined, this thing could handle it. I also think the S5 is for people who really just want to have fun and aren't worried about spending 650 bucks on a cool toy. While this could be a good commuting vehicle, it's also fun for just going around town, going to the grocery store, going to a coffee shop, whatever, and using the thing to just get outside and really have a good time. I had a lot of fun reviewing the S5. This was one of the cooler electric scooters I've tested so far. I hope you guys dug this review. If you have any questions or comments, leave them down in the comment section below. If there's any other electric scooter, electric skateboard, electric bike, or anything else that you want me to cover, leave that in the comments below as well, and I'll try to get back to you guys as quickly as possible. So thank you again so much for tuning in. Have a great day, and peace.